Many thanks for joining us on the program One Slot. My name is Rita Omodia. The African continent has long been grappling with a significant and complex challenge, the refugee crisis. With millions of people fleeing their homes due to conflicts, persecution and other forms of violence, Africa finds itself at the epicenter of one of the most pressing humanitarian issues of our time. From the vast deserts of North Africa to the lush rainforests of Central Africa, the continent is marked by a relentless flow of displaced individuals seeking safety and a refuge. As the world commemorates Refugee Day, today on One Slot, we put a focus on the plight of those fleeing conflict or persecution, while also seeking ways to peaceful conflict resolution. Stay with us in One Slot for more of this conversation. The global refugee crisis has undergone a significant expansion over the past decade, with its scale more than doubling. In 2022, the UNHCR made an announcement that the total number of displaced individuals had surpassed 100 million, equating to over 1.2% of the global population being forcibly displaced from their homes. The same year, Eritrea experienced a troubling milestone as the number of refugees exceeded 501,000. This represents almost 14% of the country's population, all displaced due to violence and political instability. The humanitarian crisis in the Central African Republic commemorated its 10th anniversary in 2022. During this decade, the country witnessed recurring episodes of sectarian violence, leading to the displacement of over 1 million people. Among them, approximately 738,000 are classified as refugees. Sudan serves as the 5th largest country of asylum for refugees globally, including the largest population of refugees from South Sudan, faces its own growing refugee crisis. By December 2022, the number of refugees from various origins in Sudan reached over 844,000. The Democratic Republic of Congo remains entrenched in one of the world's most severe and protracted humanitarian crises, although it seldom receives prominent media coverage. Combining refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs, the country registers the highest displacement figures in Africa, with over 909,000 individuals affected. South Sudan has also experienced significant displacement, with more than 4 million of its citizens uprooted from their homes. Among them, 2.3 million have been compelled to flee the country entirely. Countries such as Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and Sudan have emerged as crucial hosts for refugees within Africa. These nations have welcomed millions of individuals fleeing neighboring conflict-ridden countries. Although these countries exhibit remarkable resilience and compassion, their resources are strained, resulting in immense challenges for both their own citizens and the refugees they accommodate. And joining me to further discuss this is Sharon Ekambaram. She is the Manager, Refugee and Migrant Rights Program at Lawyers for Human Rights. Thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us on One Slot.
Good evening.
Good evening. Looking at the cause effects, apart from the voluntary current immigration trend, it has led to the massive exodus of people from their country of origin. The world, according to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, is currently facing the highest level of displacement ever in history. So for you, what are the main factors contributing to the rising refugee crisis we're witnessing in Africa?
I think it's largely the issues that you've pointed to in your introductory comments. The conflict on the African continent is one of the major reasons why people are forced to flee. And I think I just want to underscore that point, that it's not a choice. People have to flee, otherwise their lives are at risk. So that's a big factor, whether it's what's happened in Sudan, what's happening in the DRC, what's happening in Somalia. We are witnessing these conflicts that are taking place over a long, protracted period of time. And that's also presenting a major challenge to host countries that, as you correctly pointed out, are struggling with scarce resources, but also with, places like South Africa and Kenya, Uganda, which does receive refugees, also have inequalities in their own societies. So I think these are all coming together and presenting us with a major, what I would call a humanitarian crisis of a global phenomenon.
You talked about the countries as the host countries who are accommodating these refugees. What are some of the key challenges that they face while accepting refugees into their own country?
I think that, as I pointed out, I think this to mark World Refugee Day today, we have to point out to the fact that there is no working global compact to share resources towards dealing with the plight of millions of people. And as you pointed out, that number is increasing from year to year. I think just from the last stats, the figures had gone up by close on 20 million people, increased numbers, either forcefully displaced across borders or internal displacement. And so I think that we need to call upon all sectors, including and in particular the private sector, to contribute in all the countries where we have countries hosting refugees, asylum seekers, to contribute towards ensuring that people who flee are not fleeing to conditions where they are subjected to, as in the case of South Africa, the kind of xenophobia that we've experienced, or that they struggle to eke out an existence because there is no support from various sectors in society. So, I think that while we can appreciate that there is serious inequalities and yet countries are still respecting the conventions they've signed on to receive refugees and offer protection, the question of resources is a major challenge that many countries are struggling with.
Now, earlier on, you mentioned conflict and political instability being one of the major issues while we're seeing an increased rate of refugee crisis in Africa. I wonder if also, as part of the factors, climate change has a role to play when we talk about refugee crisis in Africa.
Absolutely. And I think that we're not recognizing the impact of the climate crisis in causing people to flee and climate refugees. The UNHCR a few years ago produced results and statistics saying between 2008 and 2016, close on 20 million people were displaced internally or across borders as a direct consequence of the climate crisis. And I think that we have seen the impact in Mozambique a few years ago with the cyclone. We are witnessing severe extreme weather patterns, whether it's drought or excessive rain, which makes it impossible for people to live off, larger proportions on the planet. And we as a species, as the human race, we've had at a global level, and I want to emphasize that this is not a problem for Africa. This is not a problem for any one country. This is a global problem, and we need to unite globally, internationally, to hold hands and to respond to this crisis.
And in responding to this crisis, I mean, a day like this makes us to, try and live up to what exactly these refugees face. I mean, you talked about the fact that this was not voluntary. They had to leave so that they can be safe. So tell us more about the experiences that refugees face in leaving their country of origin to go to another place that they're not sure of. What are some of the issues that they face? What are the experiences?
Well, we've witnessed, headline news of people taking excessive risks, whether it's on boats across the sea to try and get to Europe to flee the conflict and the situation that they're living under, or whether on the African continent, the paths that refugees have to traverse, they exposed to not only the hazardous conditions, whether it's crocodiles across the Limpopo River, or whether it's animals that they are exposed to that can attack them, but they're also targeted by criminals. In South Africa, it's the notorious Guma Guma gangs that target the most vulnerable for whatever resources they may have, money that they come with, and people are left destitute. And I think that it'll be remiss of me not to then speak about, in our instance, in South Africa, that when people arrive here, they're then subjected to this horrible face of xenophobia that we witnessed with violence, the infamous period of 2008. And this has been ongoing with more recent emergence of vigilantism through bodies, how you want to describe them, things like Operation Dudula, which is aimed at cleaning out South Africans of all foreign nationals. And this adds to the shocking plight that refugees, asylum seekers have to deal with in merely trying to ensure that their lives and that of their families are protected.
I can just imagine the psychological trauma that they go through. I mean, living their own country of origin. And I'm seeing a recent data at the end of 2022, and he pegged that the forcibly displaced people nationwide at 108.4 million, with 43.3 million of them as children below 18 years of age. So how have children or young adults been impacted by this refugee crisis?
Yes, I think that's also, a thing that we have to think about, is that whether it's women or men who are fleeing, have to flee with their families. Their young children are at risk of being killed as well. And that's a horrible blight on humanity, on what measures people have to take, and what, especially subjecting young people, little children, in this journey to flee conflict and climate crisis, and increasingly other reasons why they have to flee because of persecution and complete trampling of basic human rights and respect for human dignity.
Okay, Sharon, still looking at this respect for human dignity. I mean, I know that some countries have some policies in accommodating refugees. You talked about Kenya, Ethiopia. It seems that they operate in open door policies. So what other policies can be done to make sure that, the human rights or the rights of these refugees are upheld in these various countries and they are also accepted in these countries?
Look, I think, as I said, we need to actually have a global compact. There is one, but I'm not sure that the various role players are heeding to the call to contribute towards mobilization of resources at an international level. I think we have seen how the war in Europe has impacted on diminishing the amount of resources that are available by bodies like the UNHCR towards protection for refugees in host countries like South Africa and Kenya and Botswana. Many countries on the Southern African part of the continent are receiving refugees, and the amount of money that's being made available to ensure that we can support the refugees is reducing. And I think that we need to speak out about that. How do these decisions get made on how resources are allocated, how funds are raised for this purpose? And I think in all of this, for me, the private sector has got to contribute. This is a global issue that's affecting humanity across the continent and across the planet. And we've got to come together to share our resources, contribute towards ensuring that if people are fleeing conflict, if they are fleeing because of persecution and denial of their basic human rights, if they are fleeing because of the climate crisis, then we as human beings can actually ensure that they have the kind of protection they need, the respect for their human rights and dignity. And this is a severe casualty in this current period that we're living in.
I do agree with you that this refugee crisis is a global challenge on humanity, and I also wonder how it intersects with all the global challenges we're facing, especially when we talk about the health crisis. We also look at the poverty index. How do two of them relate? I mean, when we look at refugee crisis and these other issues.
You know, I think that there isn't a crisis of money. There isn't a crisis of resources. The problem is that it's only the rich that are getting richer in the world, and the most vulnerable, living predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and in the southern hemisphere, are facing the indignity of excessive poverty, of inequality, and those issues have to be addressed. We know that that situation exists because of a thing called colonization. We know that the inequality in the world exists because, in our case in South Africa, our history of apartheid. So in dealing with this issue of refugees and mobilizing resources for refugees, we also have to look at how we ensure that there is more equality in the world. That's a major contributing factor to not being able to address the plight of refugees fleeing different countries, aside from actually what are we doing to resolve those conflicts. If you look at Southern Africa, Zimbabwe is in a major crisis, political and economic. What is South Africa doing as part of SADC to address that crisis in their democracy? Similarly in Eswatini, and that's what's causing people to move. And we have to, as a species, as I said, also address what is causing people to flee their homes. It's the most difficult thing for a human being to do, to get up and have to leave your home, your family, everything that you have built. And so I think that while we mark World Refugee Day, we also have to reflect as what are we doing as the various countries in contributing to reduce the levels of conflict and violence on our continent.
And reducing, yes, and in reducing the level of violence in the continent, looking at regional cooperation, and we're seeing the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, that this came into effect in 2012. How effective has this been so far?
You know, I think the challenge is this concept, this notion of sovereignty of the nation state. So if you have these conventions, and the African Union has a 2060, I think, agenda of free movement on the African continent, of peace, of resolving the conflicts. But if you have each nation state with the power that they have, that actually is a factor in preventing us from having a Pan-African solution to our problems on the African continent. Looking at the globe, as I said, as an international response to the various conflicts, to the inequalities, and I think that if you look at all the conflicts, if you look at the politics of the world, a lot of the factors stem from this notion of sovereignty. And what we are seeing is a very, very scary rise of national chauvinism, which actually goes directly in contrast to the notions of solidarity, of global, international, embracing things like the displacement of human beings, the need for people to flee conflict, and where we can, as human beings, as a human race, share and hold hands in trying to deal with those problems.
Now, quickly, Sharon, I'm looking at the theme for this year's World Refugee Day, and it talks about hope away from home, a world where refugees are always included. And you talked about the fact that it's not just an African problem, it's a global challenge. So how can civil society organizations, how can non-governmental organizations, how can different stakeholders help to deal with this issue of refugee crisis in Africa?
Well, I think it's very telling to say home away from home. And home, as we all know, is a space where we have resources, we can live a decent life, we can have access to fresh, clean water, we can have access to a decent income that would enable us to live and have our families with us. And so for me, it goes back to the point that there can't be the notion of home away from home unless we, as the various components of a society, the private sector, the multinational corporates, the state and civil society, we all contribute and rally our resources to make that possible, for not just for refugees and asylum seekers, but all people on the move for whatever reason, whether it's because of the climate crisis, because of conflict, or because of persecution, simply because of your sexual orientation. We have got to, as the human race, ensure that we can make it possible for people to be able to feel at home away from home.
And still talking about this hope away from home and home away from home, I know I saw a video talked about the educational challenges, talk about job opportunities for refugees. What policies can government give to make sure that, these refugees are well settled in this new place that they found themselves in?
Well, I mean, I can only speak about our experience in South Africa, and we have coined this phrase called social cohesion. A lot of effort is being put into attempting to ensure that we, as the South Africans, are engaging with and working with foreign nationals, refugees, asylum seekers, and I think that I feel there has to be more political will from all sides, from civil society, from the trade union movement, from the private sector, from the government, to ensure that we can enable people who have come to our country, who have got the